Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Bridget Haire from the Kirby Institute. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I am joining today, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. I note that those of us who are not Aboriginal have a special responsibility to make the Kirby Institute and UNSW culturally safe, welcoming and supportive for Aboriginal students and staff. So welcome everybody to our special seminar to mark International Women's Day from yesterday, the 8th of March. Today is also the International Day of Women Living with HIV, so a special warm welcome to any women with HIV who are with us today. I'm going to first begin with a quick overview of the session. The format for the seminar will start off with 3 presentations, followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A. Our panel will be facilitated by our special guest, Liz Duck-Chong. We invite you to interact and to ask questions of our speakers by typing in your questions throughout their talks and discussion. To ask a question, click on the icon with the speech bubble and question mark on the top right-hand corner and open the Q&A chat screen. When you click on Ask a Question, please remember to write your name to help us reference your question. You can also upvote any questions you'd like to have answered. Also, you can change the order of questions by clicking on the tab on the top right of the Q&A chat, which says Most Recent, and changing it to Most Liked. Also, the live closed captioning is available during this webinar. You can enable live captioning by clicking the closed captioning button that says CC in the bottom right corner of the video player. I'd now like to begin by introducing the Kirby Institute Director, Professor Anthony Kelleher. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks, Bridget, and good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tony Kelleher. I'm the Director of the Kirby Institute. And before we begin, I'd like to also acknowledge the Bidigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I am joining this meeting, that is on the Kensington campus. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who are joining us today. The Kirby Institute is extremely proud of the support to support the celebration of International Women's Day each year. We have a strong commitment to equity and inclusion, not only for our staff and our students, but also across all the research which we do. International Women's Day is an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of the many extraordinary women with whom we work. And it's also an important opportunity to listen, share and learn about where we can do better in achieving gender equity in our workplaces and more broadly in our lives. These are all very vital conversations, aspects of which have gained particular prominence over the last days to weeks. These conversations must not only be had, but they must be acted upon as well. At the Kirby Institute, we have a very good gender balance in our academic workforce and in our professional workforce, which are both, the professional workforce is in fact female dominated, and we have also a female dominated workforce in the academic workforce at levels A to D. But we look forward to getting a better balance at the highest level, which is level E or professorship. And we have been making strides in this area, and I hope to continue those strides year by year. Currently, the gender gap at professorship is 1/3, 2/3 biased towards the males, but that's up from 20% 3 or 4 years ago. And in the leadership of our cross-cutting themes, which is a new initiative within the Kirby that I initiated, the leadership of those cross-cutting themes is 2/3 women. 50% of our promotions to level E over the last 2 to 3 years have been women, and all our Scientia fellows which is the closest thing we have in this university to tenure track at level A to D, are all women. So we hope to fix the current gender bias in the next couple of years with these initiatives that are underway at the Kirby. The women speaking today are leaders in their fields and have been teachers and advocates not only throughout the pandemic in the last year, but through the diverse areas in which they work. I'm really looking forward to hearing their insights, and I'll hand back to you, Bridget. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. International Women's Day is an opportunity for us to come together and celebrate women. And it's also an opportunity to reflect on how far we have yet to go to achieve gender equity. I think I'm not alone in saying that the events of the past few weeks have demonstrated both how toxic culture and structural inequalities impact on women in our places of work and in the wider community. This includes sexual violence and sexual misconduct. And I want to let you know that our panellists may talk about these issues. If anyone here has experienced sexual violence or misconduct at UNSW, please consider speaking to a first responder and making a complaint through the portal, in addition to whatever you decide about notifying the police. You can access this by Googling UNSW sexual misconduct and everything is there. It's on the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion site. But while we might rage both collectively and individually at sexual violence perpetrated against women, let's also take the time to celebrate women's achievements. The women we'll be hearing from today have been leaders in their respective fields throughout the COVID pandemic and indeed more broadly and for a long time. They have provided advice and support during what has been an extremely challenging time for many people, particularly those who experience discrimination and marginalisation. It's so important to have these women at the helm, and it's critical that we keep listening to people's experiences so that we can continue to strive to do better. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Raina MacIntyre. Many of you will recognise Raina as she has been one of Australia's leading epidemiologists who has communicated the latest scientific knowledge about COVID-19 widely in the media throughout the pandemic. I don't know about you, but whenever something new happens in the epidemic, my family say to me, well, what does Raina say? Just tell us what Raina's saying and then we'll know what's going on. So Raina is a Professor of Global Biosecurity. She's an NHMRC Principal Research Fellow and Head of the Biosecurity Program at the Kirby Institute, UNSW Australia. She leads a program in control and prevention of infectious diseases, spanning vaccinology, pandemics, emerging infections, and personal protective equipment. Raina is passionate about diversity in medicine and has been active in UNSW mentoring programs. She's chaired the Women's Employment Strategy Committee for UNSW Medicine for 8 years and is currently on the Kirby Equity and Diversity Committee and the Cultural Diversity Working Group for UNSW. Welcome, Raina.
Thank you, Bridget. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm standing upon, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I read the late Jill Conway's autobiographical book, The Road from Koorain, when I was 16. It outlines her journey from a remote sheep station in New South Wales to the University of Sydney and then to Harvard to become finally the president of Smith College in the US. She was a talented woman but was flatly denied career opportunities by all-male selection panels in Australia. She couldn't even get a job. So she left for the US, where she flourished and rose to the very top of academic life within a more merit-based system. We have come a long way since then, but then again, many things haven't changed that much. As Bridget and Tony have already mentioned, the national conversation that we're having right now about sexual harassment and abuse and the overriding importance of men's careers over everything else reminds us that we haven't come far at all. How people get ahead in Australia is the subject of research published in a book called The Game of Mates from an academic in ANU, which found that using objective metrics, Australia actually has more in common with Indonesia and Turkey than it does with the US and the UK when it comes to meritocracy. And if you followed the news in the last few weeks, you too may have been struck, as I was, about the tight-knit circles of white male power, privilege and entitlement that go all the way back to elite private schools. Meanwhile, the university sector has been hit very hard by the pandemic and the loss of international students. Many people around us, our friends and our colleagues, have lost their jobs in the last year, and others still are in insecure temporary arrangements, struggling from contract to contract in a rapidly diminishing sector. And I noticed a Women in STEM tweet yesterday demanding the end of contracts, which just, I couldn't see how that was feasible in the current financial situation that universities are in, with no respite and no bailout available in sight. I haven't seen the data, but I'd guessed from reports in work sectors outside of the university that women are more affected than men. The impact on the pandemic for me, however, has been favourable because it's my core area of expertise and research. Working from home has also been fantastic for me, saving me 2 to 3 hours a day commuting each day, which gives me much more productive work time. We've been able to communicate and work in teams virtually and be also more engaged globally as a result of everybody embracing the technology that we've had at our fingertips for a long time, but we've never really utilised it. I was able to accept invitations to present at conferences overseas without wasting days and days on international travel, and had several Friday night virtual drinks, not just with colleagues from UNSW or from Sydney, but with groups of people coming together from cities around the country and also around the world who may not have got together socially if we were stuck in our face-to-face traditions. So I think flexibility in work was a big lesson from the pandemic. While there are many reasons why people enjoy coming to work, such as the coffee room chats, or if their home environment just isn't conducive to work, productive work is possible in many different settings and people's needs vary, and we should retain that flexibility. Women with caring responsibilities may be able to work more effectively and more likely to be retained in the talent pool. You know, we have this loss of women from the talent pool as they get older and as families and children come into it. So if we have that flexible arrangement, maybe we can retain more talented women in the system so they can progress to those higher levels. However, for women who experience domestic abuse at home, the work is a retreat, and it's really important to be able to come to work. Conversely, for women experiencing harassment in the workplace, working from home may be a welcome alternative. I think the diversity agenda doesn't delve deeply enough into structural racism and sexism. I'll talk a little bit about racism. The kind that involves verbal abuse or spitting or violence is what I cut my teeth on in the school playground in the 1970s, eastern suburbs Sydney, where there were very few non-white children. So I'm quite resilient to overt racism. It really doesn't touch me very much. The more dangerous and damaging kind of racism is the kind that hides beneath a veneer of civility and politeness, the kind that I do see professionally from time to time, the kind where your success is bitterly resented and undermined, deliberately hidden sometimes, even when it benefits the organisation in a way that the success of white people rarely is. The kind that prompted JAMA to tweet last week, if you followed this, they tweeted, "No physician is racist, so how can there be structural racism in healthcare?" Of course, that received a huge backlash and outrage. But the less obvious implication of that tweet is that it's talking about physicians as white physicians. So the assumption there is only the viewpoint of the white physician matters. No physician is racist. The other issue is that when you're an internationally recognised expert and when you speak truth to power in your area of expertise about something that is in the best interests of population health, if you're a woman of colour, you can be attacked with a kind of viciousness and disrespect that is never given to men. I'll tell you another story about a friend who's also a woman of colour. She was recently the Deputy Director of the Queensland Art Gallery, but was passed over for the director job. She was then recruited to head up a new, very prestigious gallery in Hong Kong called M. The New York Times did a full-page story about her appointment, but there was absolutely nothing about it in the Australian press. And subsequently, when she was in the job, an Australian minister was visiting Hong Kong, and she met him at some event. She was introduced to him, and he asked her, he sort of frowned and said, "So are you actually Australian?" I've got a similar story, right? In 2019, I was invited to be on a panel on pandemics and existential threats at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. There was a US-based Australian futurist also on the panel, and I think he'd heard there was an Australian woman on the panel. So he walked into the green room quite late and went straight to the white American novelist, female novelist, who was on the panel, and asked her, "Are you the other Australian?" We even have qualified citizenship in Australia under a series of new legislative changes over the last decade that allows government to strip foreign-born people of citizenship. I pay my taxes like everyone else. I contribute to the country, but my citizenship is less secure than that of a white person born here. If you didn't know that, then that illustrates white privilege. Finally, we should also remember the national conversation today about sexual assault and sexual harassment. We've heard of the kind of high prevalence of sexual assault in girls in high school. Those same kids come to university and become undergraduates, and the same problems very likely come onto campuses. We've also heard about relationships between powerful men and junior women, which end with the woman having to leave her job. These same issues are likely all around us at the workplace, and we need to make sure that victims can come forward without fear of retribution, without fear of harming their career or any penalties, and knowing that they'll be safe and that the perpetrators will not be protected because a man's future career is more important than them. I have to finish saying that I'm very privileged to work at the Kirby Institute. It's a wonderful institute and a home for me, and there are many wonderful men and women here. I'm especially grateful to the late David Cooper, who facilitated my coming to the Kirby, and to the support of Professor Tony Kelleher, our director. However, when we consider the world around us, for me, it's hard to imagine an egalitarian future, not in this world where we live, where equality seems to be going backward. Pay gaps, class gaps, inequity is widening, and hate speech is being enabled and normalised. We can't just live in the university bubble. We've got to look at what's going on around us in the media, in society more widely. Still, we can do what we can to try and inspire and mentor and support young people from diverse backgrounds to reach their full potential, and thereby maximise their potential to drive positive change in the future, because the young people today are the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Raina, for those very stirring words and for making such very important points. I'd now like to introduce Professor Jackie Leach Scully. Jackie's a Professor of Bioethics and a Director of the Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW. With a background in molecular oncology and neuroscience, she's specialised in ethical issues in biomedicine and the life sciences, particularly their relevance to people with disability. Her research has included bioethics of prenatal selection, mitochondrial replacement, genome editing, assistive technologies, and global health emergencies. She's currently a Chief Investigator at the ARC Centre for Excellence in Automated Decision-Making in Society, and separate projects looking at reproductive autonomy, epigenetics, and genetic testing for people with intellectual disability. She's also writing on the patient experience in organ transplantation. In 2020, Jackie was named as one of Australia's outstanding 50 LGBTI+ leaders. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on. That's Camaragalgan, land for me, and to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people here today. So you've had an introduction to me. I'm a bioethicist. I'm also a disability activist. I have been deaf since I was a child. I'm now director of the Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW. We do a broad range of work, and unlike I think many disability related research centres or institutes, Our ethos has always been that disability is part of the human condition rather than solely a problem to be solved. And in a sense, that has meant rejecting the idea of the marginalisation of people with disability by emphasising that disabled people are not marginal. Statistically, around 20% of all Australians at any moment consider themselves to be disabled. Nevertheless, it's very clear that in practice, people with disability are marginalised. In Australia, people with disability have much lower rates of employment than people without. That's 48% to around 80%. And at least some of that difference is due to discrimination or presence of avoidable barriers to employment. Around 40 to 45% of employed people with disabilities say they've experienced discrimination or unfair treatment from employers or work colleagues. Now, the impact of the COVID pandemic on people with disability, unsurprisingly, was complex. It's unsurprising because the population of people with disability is not homogeneous. And in addition, many also experience marginalisation for some other reason, such as race, ethnicity, often sex or gender identity. I want to talk a little bit about women with disability specifically today. They've suffered the intersecting consequences of those two axes of marginalisation, by sex and by disability. And we all know now that intersecting oppression isn't additive. It's not straightforwardly, twice as bad because you have two of these, but rather it results in distinct forms of injustice. So to be a disabled woman means experiencing injustices in ways that a non-disabled woman or a disabled man might not. There have been any number of examples during the COVID pandemic where existing and ongoing discrimination against women with disability, their isolation, for example, has been exacerbated by the pandemic and by the public health measures that had to be taken to control it. So there's been the economic impact, for example, of closures and of job losses. Women with disability are much more likely than equivalently disabled men to be unemployed or underemployed, to earn less, and as women to be in the kind of precarious and partial and subsistence employment that makes them first in line for their jobs to be cut and last, if ever, for those jobs to be restored. Many disabled children and young people have lost access to specialised schooling or educational supports during the COVID pandemic, and that has a particularly damaging impact on girls from cultures where it's not common for girls to be educated, let alone girls with disabilities, and how that's going to be remedied post-pandemic is a particular puzzle. But perhaps people are less familiar with the more specific consequences for people with disability that have included the sudden disappearance of services that are essential to their lives. So there are any number of accounts that have been heard, for example, by the Disability Royal Commission's hearing on the impact of COVID on disabled people. Examples of essential support staff just not turning up one morning to help someone out of bed, to help them go to the toilet, to buy essential food and medication, and that situation may persist for days. There has been the inability of some people with disabilities to shield themselves from infection, however much they may want to do that, because they need casual staff to enter their home every single day. And that's been combined with the lack of personal protective equipment for them or for the staff. There's been confusing or inaccessible information from government and health services, especially in the case of people with intellectual disability. I know that I've often struggled to follow sometimes the successive, sometimes conflicting health messages from government, and you can imagine how that might be compounded for somebody with even a moderate learning disability. There have been many painful accounts from people with disability of these experiences, but looking closely at the data, it's clear that women are more likely to be directly and indirectly affected here, in part because of the gender distribution of care activities. The fact that women are more likely than men to be carers within a family or professionally as carers means, first of all, that disabled men are often able to rely on a spouse where disabled women can't. And often also that disabled women will find themselves in the role of carers to others despite their own impairments, and thereby compounding the effects of their disability. At the outset of the pandemic, there was a lot of fear that disabled people would be given lower priority for access to critical care, such as intubation or a bed in the ICU, or to vaccines. A lower priority being unethical, but that fear was not unrealistic, given that in many countries, in fact, the official guidance has implicitly and in some cases explicitly stated that disabled people should not be prioritised for such care. This was the kind of area where I was particularly active in the mid part of last year, and again now in context of vaccination, both academically in the policy and public engagement domains. And I think this fear of discrimination is part of a much more general issue that public discussion around COVID has given some very disturbing insights into residual attitudes that the lives of people with disability are of less value or are burdensome even to themselves, but certainly to society. And that's been revealed in the kind of social media and sometimes more official commentary that says things like COVID is not something to worry about for most of us because it only kills people who are old or have underlying conditions. You know, we know that that's not true, but the poisonous bit there is the only, as if people with underlying conditions, many of whom are disabled, are somehow less important. One of my colleagues referred to the elephant in the room over the last couple of weeks has been the knowledge that we've been gaining about the prevalence of sexual assault, sexual abuse, and so on. And that knowledge is that even under normal circumstances, women with disability are much more likely than non-disabled women to experience domestic and sexual violence. A lot of studies have shown that women with disability are around twice as likely to have experienced sexual violence as adults, and even more likely than that to have experienced it as children. There are complicated reasons for this. It's not always obvious in the sense of not being able to escape or not being able to articulate what has been going on. One of these, I think, is a residual lack of belief, at least for those people for whom sexual assault is primarily about attraction rather than control and power, the lack of belief that people with disability can be attractive. And I can remember when I was at school as a child, one of my acquaintances, let's say, who was assaulted by a male, was brave enough to bring a complaint. She had cerebral palsy. She was incontinent because of that. And when she brought the complaint, one of the things that was said to her, and I quote, "Why ever would anybody want to try to have sex with a nasty, smelly little girl like you?" Now, those are the kind of things that we have to contend with. And now we know that domestic and sexual violence has rocketed during lockdown due to those heightened tensions and stresses, as well as sheer isolation. And for many people with disability, that's meant that group facilities may not be visited by community visitors or by families who will be more aware of the potential for abuse that may be going on. So one of the things that I think all of this exposes is just the straightforward lack of data that we have about the specific experiences of women with disability. So I think it's vital to ensure going forward that there is ongoing research into these important areas, and research in which data are disaggregated by sex and disability, and research which is inclusive of people with disability and responsive to those women with disability and community-based groups of women with disability who have such important knowledge about their own situations and their own vulnerabilities. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Jackie. My head is spinning from that story that you told. How absolutely appalling. Finally, It's my pleasure to introduce to you Jules Kim. Jules is a Korean-Australian sex worker and the CEO of the Scarlet Alliance, the Australian Sex Workers Association, the peak national organisation that's been representing sex workers and sex worker organisations, collectives and projects throughout Australia since 1989. She's the chair of the Regional Sex Worker Network, the Asia Pacific Network of Sex Workers, and is the UNAIDS Program Coordinating Board NGO Delegate for Australia Pacific for 2019 to 21. Jules represents sex workers on a number of government committees and advisory mechanisms. I've had the pleasure of being on some of those with her. She has over 20 years experience in sex worker advocacy and community development and representation. Thank you, Jules.
Thanks, Bridget. I think I'd like to start in celebrating leaders, female leaders. We just a few days ago had a massive loss with the death of Jude Byrne, who was an incredible leader in the Australian community movement, not just, and a loss is felt here, not just in Australia, but also overseas. She was an amazing advocate for people who use drugs, and it's a massive loss for all of us. So I'm going to speak about the impact of COVID on sex workers, and the understanding of the lives and experience of sex workers during COVID-19 must be undertaken in the context of criminalisation, stigma and discrimination, and reduced access to healthcare, housing and welfare supports, and over-policing, under-resourcing and lack of access to appropriate services and support, as well as the precarious employment of many workers in the sex industry. Even outside the context of COVID, concerns for privacy and the ability to self-determine disclosure of sex work status, or the fear of being stigmatised or shamed, or the fear of very real fear of legal consequences, have prevented sex workers from seeking support. The impact of COVID on individual sex workers are as diverse as our community, and unfortunately fall disproportionately on more marginalised sex workers. Similar to many Australians, sex workers were impacted by the sudden closures, lockdown and loss of livelihood brought about by COVID. But different for us were that many of us did not have access to necessary government supports. Of course, unlike many other countries where sex work is completely criminalised, we were fortunate that many sex workers were able to have access to JobKeeper and JobSeeker. However, many more of us were ineligible due to the inconsistent legal frameworks in Australia, where sex work laws are different in each state and territory, and also differ depending on the sector, the section of the sex industry that the type of sex work that you do. And of course, we are subject to widespread stigma and discrimination that placed sex workers in the very difficult position of having to balance the need to protect themselves and their families against the prospect of having no income or no access to financial relief. And for the many migrant sex workers, they were entirely ineligible for those supports. What else was apparent was that how quickly during the pandemic, sex workers were again sidelined and forgotten. Very early on in the pandemic, we began, Scarlet Alliance and our member organisation, began receiving numerous reports of sex workers being targeted by police. As we know, policing has remained one of the major threats to sex workers and hampers our ability to employ work health and safety strategies at work. What we also know from sex workers' successful response to HIV and other BPVs and STIs is that policing is not an effective public health strategy and in fact is largely counterproductive. We heard too many reports of police checking up on known sex workers while they were at home with their families. We had numerous reports of police targeting and fining of individual sex workers who were already vulnerable after significant loss of income and ineligibility for support. And fining these workers only served to make people feel more vulnerable and to be and did not support the public health measures that were in place. As an example, just in one month, in July 2020, there were over 1 week in Victoria, there were over 50 COVID fines to sex workers in just 1 week. There were a 15-fold increase in non-COVID charges against sex workers in Queensland just in that first month back to work. And more than 20 sex workers in that month reported human rights abuses by police. And unfortunately, many of the sex industry businesses that were targeted were Asian businesses providing massage and sexual services. Also, we found that in the initial return to work plans that came about and the roadmaps for return to work did not include sex workers. Even when the first return to work roadmap came about, the 3-step framework issued by the National Cabinet for easing restrictions, sex industry businesses, namely brothels and strip clubs, were at that time the only industry that were explicitly named to remain closed, even beyond step 3. And this is despite other person-to-person contact industries and personal services being able to return to work. The compounding tensions of the lack of income, exclusion from return to work plans, increased surveilling and policing and fining, isolation from friends, families and peers, and potential for stigma at every point of contact with support services caused alarming negative mental health impacts for our community, and increased demand for sex worker friendly mental health services, as well as on the sex worker organisations, were profound at that time. What was heartening was the response, the amazing response against this backdrop. Sex workers were incredibly proactive in responding to the crisis in the community. Even before restrictions had come into place, sex workers had already adapted their work practices and were employing safety strategies at work, or enhancing safety strategies at work, or adapting to non-contact services. Individual sex workers and the formal and informal networks and sex worker organisations made incredible contributions to the response during COVID. As a marginalised population, sex workers take a high level of responsibility for ensuring one another's survival during times of crisis. And here I just want to acknowledge the sex workers who took it upon themselves to lead workshops and organise fundraisers, coordinate mutual aid networks, and it was just an extraordinary show of the ethic of mutual care and resource sharing in sex worker networks, which is a strength that supported us even where other structures did not. In March, in response, Scarlet Alliance established the National Cabinet of Haires, which met once a week. And the membership of the National Cabinet of Haires included the state and territory member organisations of Scarlet Alliance, and that includes SWAP ACT, SWAP NT, SWAP New South Wales, Magenta and SWARE in WA, SYN in South Australia, Respect in Queensland, Scarlet Alliance Tasmania, and Vixen Collective in Melbourne in Victoria. Together, we continued to meet during COVID to develop resources on public health directives, on the ever-changing public health directives. We created harm reduction resources for sex workers, and we also produced resources on how to adapt or get started into online work. We produced resources on applying for JobKeeper or JobSeeker, as well as resources for those who were ineligible and alternate supports that might have been available for those people. And these were all translated by the network of called peer educators around Australia. We also advocated for government financial support, and unfortunately when this fell on deaf ears, we started the Emergency Support Fund, which was administered through Scarlet Alliance, with 100% of those funds collected in donations paid out to sex workers. Each week, a subcommittee of sex workers met to allocate the funds based on the self-assessment that was completed in Thai, simplified and traditional Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese and English. Each week these were back translated by a team of bilingual peer educators. And these were paid out to sex workers, and by November, when most of the states and territories were back to work, 760 payments to sex workers were made, totalling $180,998. Unfortunately, we were only, the demand far exceeded the donations, but we were able to support approximately about 49% of the people who had applied for the funds. Additionally, significant advocacy was undertaken by the National Cabinet of Haire as well, federally and in the states and territories, to get sex workers included in those return to work plans, and to demonstrate that sex workers can employ work health and safety strategies and risk mitigation strategies in order to return to work. Our advocacy work included impact statements outlining the needs of sex workers and calling for immediate financial support for marginalised sex workers, and advocating for the treatment of sex work as work in the design of lockdown measures and industry closures, as well as their reversals as community transmissions decreased. We liaised directly with state and local police units, making clear the ways in which sex workers had been unfairly and disproportionately targeted, and calling for an end to discriminatory policing and surveillance. We supported individual sex workers who had experienced the negative impacts of targeted enforcements or who had been wrongfully penalised. And of course, we challenged the stigma and raised awareness about sex worker issues related to COVID-19 in the media. And what we learnt from this experience was the need to recognise sex workers' work, even when during the pandemic, and recognising that sex workers and sex worker organisations are leaders, partners and experts, and part of the solution, as we had demonstrated during the HIV epidemic and also demonstrated during the COVID pandemic. We hope that through this experience that better communication and collaboration with sex worker organisations would come about. It was also recognised the urgent need to have a consistent model of the decriminalisation of sex work because of the inconsistent legal frameworks across the jurisdictions in Australia. It made it incredibly difficult for sex workers to be able to access support and for there to be a coordinated response. And most importantly, what we learned from this experience was the extraordinary commitment and dedication of sex workers to respond to a public health crisis and to fill the gaps that were left behind in the government responses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jules. It's really quite inspiring to hear about such innovative and imaginative work. I really appreciate what you've talked to us today about. I'd now like to introduce to you Liz Duck-Chong, who's going to be facilitating the panel conversation. Liz is a freelance writer, a health researcher, a filmmaker and a peer worker whose essays and non-fiction have been published widely. Now, if you haven't yet listened to her podcast on sex and sexuality, Let's Do It with Alex Robinson, I strongly advise you to. I think it's something that everybody will get something out of. If it's not for you, it might be for your children. But do give it a go. Now over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Bridget. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Liz Duck-Chong, and I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'm living and working on Gadigal land at the moment, which is part of the extraordinary Eora Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today, especially any sister girls or brother boys who are in our audience. So I have many hats, including, as Bridget mentioned, a health researcher, freelance writer. I do some amateur carpentry, but the majority of my work in this past year has actually been in health promotion at ACON, working on sites like Trans Hub and another range of trans health projects and wider queer community health projects. And so it was a real pleasure and an interesting challenge being asked to kind of present a little bit today and to bring this panel together to really look at what the past year looks like. And before I go to the rest of our panelists, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about me and my work and kind of where I'm coming from. So I'm a proud trans woman here in front of you today, and I'm incredibly pleased and feel the privilege of being here in celebration of yesterday's International Women's Day. And I really want to recognise the gender expansive forebears that paved the way for trans people in history, and who would have never been given the opportunity or voice that I have today. So thank you. In my work and in my personal life, I've watched the ways that COVID-19 has affected the trans community of all genders. And today I really want to talk a little bit and think a little bit about trans women, trans feminine people, and really anyone of any gender who has who feels a sense of solidarity with or a home in womanhood. Trans women experience incredibly high rates of unemployment and excessive marginalisation in workplaces when they do work, especially including my trans sisters who do sex work, and I experience a range of other health disparities and personal disparities around access of healthcare systems, discriminations, being barred from service, homelessness, and high rates of mental health afflictions and suicidality, all of which come from the ways that we are treated by and disregarded by society. None of these things are inherent to the trans experience, the same as they're not inherent to any other marginalised experience of womanhood, and yet they are things that we do experience. And they've also not gone anywhere during COVID. In thinking about the ways that COVID has affected my communities, as well as thinking about talking about how it has affected the communities of the other speakers here today. These are shared experiences that COVID has simply further entrenched these systems and these difficulties that women face around the world and in Australia. And I say this as someone who's proud to be here, but also aware that International Women's Day has a history rooted in workers' rights, class struggle, anti-exploitation efforts around the start of the last century. And in many cases, it's kind of become a chance to gird the pink fist of girl bosses and become a bit of a token effort at inclusion and tolerance. And really in my work in the trans community, these words, inclusion and tolerance, are words to be pretty cautious of. I really don't believe that our work is done until we blow past these ideas and arrive at love, community, appreciation, celebration, uplifting people and supporting people to be the best that they can be. And so that's really what I want to try and get to today, is asking a little bit more about some of these things that have come up, plunging a little bit further into the ways that COVID is affecting women in Australia, around the world, but also try and find that core of community celebration and uplifting women, not by, giving them a bouquet of flowers or anything like that, but by hearing their stories, paying homage to the women in our past and listening and learning. So I would like to open up our panel discussion with my extraordinary co-panelists and co-speakers. I would like to kind of start by asking a question to Raina based on something that you said while you were speaking, talking about this JAMA tweet, that the idea that no physician is racist, so how can there be structural racism in healthcare, and the explosion that came after that, pointing out all the ways that is just so so incorrect. But it really, I think, brought to light these experiences of discrimination and harm as being completely outside of some people's awareness, or consciously not being thought of by some health professionals, by some industry bodies. These are experiences that are being ignored or sidelined. And, you know, across this panel, we share a womanhood, but also have many other different forms of marginalisation. And I'm really interested in how you've seen your own experiences and your own existence reflected in the response to COVID. How has things like structural racism and sexism affected the response to COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Elizabeth. And I think I'm not sure if you're asking how it's affected the community in general, or as in people who've had COVID, or...
I mean, I think both, but I think the broader community in responding to COVID, it's clear that these other marginalisations have not made that any easier, and in many cases have compounded that difficulty. How have you seen those experiences?
So I think there's a lot of data now showing that there is disproportionately high morbidity and mortality in certain ethnic groups, particularly the data from the US, but even in Australia, we saw it play out at the beginning of the Victorian second wave, where there was, you know, an outbreak in a particular ethnic community in a housing tower block, and the two towers were actually locked down. That raised a lot of questions and ethical issues. I actually think from a disease control point of view, they were trying to avoid a citywide lockdown. They were hoping that localized measures would work, and this is where they identified the outbreak. But, you know, we also heard of people kind of stuck in there and unable to get food and so on. So I think there's a lot of data on disproportionate effects of the pandemic on ethnic minorities, and higher rates of death, you know, from the US data in African Americans, Hispanics, and other ethnic minorities.
Absolutely. I think we've, in many cases, we talk about Australia as having had quite a lucky experience of COVID, but there's obviously still the ways that marginalisation have affected, has caused COVID to affect some communities and not others in far more intense ways.
Well, I think one of those, which is not about racism, is the aged care sector, and we did see a very disproportionate impact in aged care. Most of the deaths were in aged care, and we saw a sort of shift in policy from, you know, I've worked in the area of flu outbreaks in aged care for a long time, and the standard practice is when someone gets flu, if they're very ill, they're moved to hospital. But the decision that happened in the very first couple of outbreaks in New South Wales, but it then changed. The policy decision was made to keep them in there and treat them in the aged care facility, which I think from a disease control point of view is not great. And we saw very explosive outbreaks, poor conditions for staff working in there as well, in terms of inadequate PPE and being in just these highly contaminated environments. And I think there's a lot around the aged care response that, and of course aged care predominantly has women in it because women live longer than men, and so there's a disproportionate number of women in aged care compared to men. So it's a very, for me it was very, very disturbing, some of the trends in aged care.
Absolutely. Is there a sense of how we might start to look at kind of changing that direction, actually addressing the groups that are left behind, people in aged care or people of other marginalised experiences? Is there a strong public health sense of how we might actually be centering those groups, or is that not really part of the conversation yet at a health level?
It's not a big part of the conversation, but on a more fundamental level, when we look at clinical trials and the data coming out of trials, frail elderly people are systematically excluded from trials, and there are reasons for that, because they've got high mortality rate, they're often not very mobile, so have difficulty coming for follow-up appointments. And so we've seen it with the COVID vaccine trials. There's very little data on frail elderly people for some of the vaccines. But that's a long-standing problem, the lack of data, the lack of trials, and then it becomes this kind of vicious cycle of no recommendation because there's no data. And so I think we do need to be making a concerted effort to include older people in our clinical trials, but also other risk groups. We know from the only data available on immunosuppressed people, for example, are from the AstraZeneca trial for HIV-infected people in South Africa, and the vaccine doesn't work as well in HIV-infected people. There's a lower efficacy. So I think, there's that whole group of people categorised in 1B who are immunosuppressed for whatever reason, whether they've got HIV or they're on medication for autoimmune disease, or they've got cancer, leukemia, whatever. We need, again, more data, more focus on research that'll actually help protect the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I do want to remind anybody who's watching that we do have, you do have the ability to ask questions to our panelists if you pop them into the Q&A. I'll be looking through those and asking those. So please, if you do have any questions or thoughts, don't feel afraid to share those with us. Jackie, I want to turn to you. You've obviously spoken just earlier about other experiences of kind of groups getting left behind. And I think for people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses, there is often already a form of interaction with health systems that is inherent to some experiences that people are having. And so how is that interplay happening of existing within health systems, but then struggling to access health systems during COVID?
Yeah, obviously that is complicated, as I said, because there's so many different kinds of impairment, of disability, of disabling conditions. Sometimes some disabled people have very regular contact with healthcare systems by virtue of their disability. Sometimes they're having regular contact for some completely unrelated reason, and sometimes they just don't, because their disability is such that they don't need that kind of health contact. I think there was quite a lot of, in fact, very positive response within Australia. I mean, we're all very good at kind of knocking in a sense, the place where we are. But I was very aware of the comparison with other countries, in particular the United Kingdom, which was very, very slow in responding to concerns about accessible information, for example. The press conferences in the government in Britain still don't provide sign language interpretation, and a legal case has had to be brought against them to try to provide that. There was a very different situation, I think, of people who are living in congregate settings or group settings because of disability, which is very similar to what Raina was talking about just now in the aged care facilities. And I think one of the issues there is that there's a past history and perhaps still a sense in the present of warehousing of people with disability, that, okay, this is a problematic group, let's stick them over there and hopefully we can forget about them while we deal with, the real people. And then at some point when we've got stuff under control, we can go back and have another look. And it became very apparent that that was in some ways precisely the wrong approach to take, because of the description we'll see as explosive outbreaks in Australia, but also much more tragically and damagingly in other parts of the world. In the UK, I think the figure is something like a person with an intellectual disability has been 6 times as likely to die of COVID than somebody without. And that's particularly the case for the younger age groups, where the usual mortality is so much lower. And yet the people with intellectual disability have been absolutely hammered because of that. I think the concern for me is to try to get across that issue of diversity, and that one can't simply say we have a strategy for dealing with disabled people, because that's not going to be how it will pan out. And some of the difficulty there is getting over the long-standing neglect of or lack of interest in the specifics of disability. And that takes me back to the point I made right at the start, that if you look at disability as a problem to be solved, you sort of want it to go away and to be dealt with as simply as possible. If you look on it as something that we just have to engage with, we all have to engage with, then that is going to be, perhaps facilitate more positive engagement with these issues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I wanna go to you now, Jules. I want to ask a bit more kind of about this interaction of work and the way that COVID has affected people. But I think one of the big kind of things that has been coming up is watching the way that the approach to COVID might be actually kind of reinforcing systems that are discriminating or do disenfranchise people. I mean, I think one of the ways that we're kind of seeing that play out directly is around this, idea of hard and soft lockdowns and kind of like having our nation's borders be like COVID free is also indirectly affecting a lot of other ways that our nation's borders have kind of had a very colonialist, racist approach. How do we make sure that the work that we're doing is not just doubling down on the structures that are already affecting people negatively?
Look, I think that it certainly did expose all those inequities during the pandemic, and that it did impact on sex workers. Interestingly, as well, I mean, even prior to COVID, Centre for Social Research and Health had done a study about the expressed stigma amongst general population and healthcare workers against priority populations, including sex workers. And unfortunately, they are still at incredibly high levels. And this is actually people admitting that they would behave negatively towards other people because of their sex work. And that was approximately, I think, 64% of the general public and actually 31% of health workers who said they would treat somebody negatively just because of their sex work. So, this is pretty heavily entrenched, and we also, sex workers still do not have access to anti-discrimination protections, which is unfortunate. There is limited coverage in some states and territories, but not in most, and even in New South Wales, where sex work is decriminalised, we still don't have anti-discrimination protections here in New South Wales. So there's a lot of these kind of structural barriers that we experience, as well as the expression of stigma and discrimination. So I think that's a battle before we even talk about COVID that we're experiencing. But I guess one of the positives of that was that sex workers were used to working around these structures that were not supportive of them. So there were these models of success and cooperation that we had, and networks, largely that came about from the HIV epidemic, funded peer sex worker organisations, as well as unfunded collectives of sex workers that came together to collaborate to kind of work around these unworkable systems, unfortunately. Obviously, we continue to campaign to try and reform these laws, and there are some really active campaigns to decriminalise sex work. And as you probably know, that NT decriminalised sex work last year, which was amazing, but unfortunately is still the third jurisdiction in the world to do so. So, I think that in most parts of the world, sex work is still largely criminalised. And unfortunately, in many states of Australia, sex work is criminalised. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but there are a lot of active campaigns to challenge those regressive laws.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that it's so worth keeping in mind that these are struggles that are ongoing even as COVID is happening. Like, they haven't paused or stopped or become less important. They're just running alongside a lot of the time. Thank you so much, Raina. I want to throw you back to you for a second and talk about just about some of what Jules brought up there. That there are a lot of negative experiences in healthcare for a lot of marginalised people, people of colour, sex workers. I know it's a big issue in the trans community. And simultaneously, we are relying on an often incredibly supportive, empowering health profession to be running the vaccination program and the testing program and all of these kind of COVID-related approaches. How do we kind of balance the importance of these systems for fighting COVID with the fact that these systems are still imperfect for many people?
Yeah, that's a good question, a very tough one as well. I think you're asking about trust in the system, in healthcare.
Absolutely.
And that's very hard if your trust has not been won in the past. I guess vaccines are a bit different, I guess, from acute healthcare. You know, when you're ill, you need treatment, whereas a vaccine is a preventive measure in people who are well, and getting vaccinated is not as invasive as, going into a hospital to get treatment. So that's one thing that might make it a bit easier. I think there's reasonably good information being put out by the government as well on vaccination programs, and there's different options for getting vaccinated depending on what state you're in. So it doesn't have, there are some vaccination sites in hospitals, some general practitioners will be vaccinating, and there might be other public vaccination clinics depending on where you are. So it might be possible to try and find a setting that's best suited to your needs. If you've got a particular GP that you trust, for example, that's empathetic to your particular needs, then that might be where you should go for your vaccination.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, there's a on the site that I've worked on, TransHub, we have a document 10 things to ask your health professional to ensure that they're gender affirming, which is for trans community, but it is very easily adaptable for any other community to kind of change out a couple of the keywords and call ahead and just make sure that you're going to have an affirming experience there. Speaking of affirming experiences, I guess, Jackie, I want to go to you next. You talked a lot about the many negative experiences that COVID has brought to communities who have disabilities, and I think that they are incredibly important to think about how we continue to fight them. But there were also some positive experiences that the kind of the global solutions to COVID did bring to many people. I'd love to hear your experience of maybe what some of the positives were.
Hi. The positives tend to get a little bit buried, of course, because positives always do, because you're more worried about the negatives than getting over them. I think as for a lot of people working from home, if they had work, was a positive, is a positive. And for many people with disability for whom getting into work has been difficult, or perhaps being at work for a standard working day, if there are issues of fatigue or concentration or attention and so on, it has been really positive to be able to manage that in a better way. The flip side of that, if you like, is I think there has been some quite legitimate resentment, impatience by many in the disabled community who in the past have been pushing for the possibility of working from home for precisely those reasons, that it's exhausting getting into work if you have a mobility impairment, it's expensive as well, and so on. And who've always been pushed back with, it's not possible, we can't do that, change takes too long, you're such a minority, etc. And then suddenly, when it became something that everybody's going to do, whiz bang, there it was. And employers were making it possible for you. So yes, there's that sense of, well, this is really good, and let's see if we can hang on to that into the future, as well as, well, you've really made clear to us how important we were before. And I think that's something that perhaps many in the disabled community will take as both a negative and a positive, that it's sometimes not always a bad thing to be reminded of just how marginal your position might be. Sometimes we take the gains too much for granted. I think digital communication too has for many people been a positive. For me, at least, it's as somebody with a hearing impairment, for those sorts of video conferencing where closed captioning is available, as it is in Teams, and I'm using it now, that's been really revolutionary, because it's sometimes very, very difficult for me to sit in a large meeting with maybe 10 or 12 people and be able to follow everything that's being said. And on the whole, let's say I'm no more disadvantaged under these systems than anybody else might be. But we still need to be adaptable around that and be aware, I think, that there are perhaps people with visual impairments for whom accessibility to the controls on video conferencing is not yet what it could be. Some screen readers don't cope with those kind of platforms very well. If you have a mobility or at least maybe a muscular control problem, that can also be difficult in using these systems and quite practically kind of moving fast enough that you can make your point before the chair of the meeting or whatever has said, okay, I'm getting nothing from anybody, I'll move on to the next one. So I think it's just going to be a question of adapting and being very conscious of where those positives lie. And a final positive point, I think, for people with disability has been a sense of greater, perhaps, political awareness and coming together, and some very effective campaigning by disabled people's organisations in Australia and elsewhere from the very outset of the pandemic, being aware of the potential problems that there might be, that I think has made a profound experience, positive difference to the experience that people with disability have had.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I want to just follow on from that and just ask, there are a lot of these things that have changed quite quickly, as you've mentioned, and there are positives to a lot of them. But how do we continue to ensure that the changes are positive for disabled communities? Like, how do we make sure that we either don't go back to exactly the way things were, or if we change further, that these things are removed or taken as not as important?
I think one of the things is to try to resist the rhetoric, however tempting it is and however much we emotionally want to do it, of going back to normality, of going back to normal life. The slogan "Build Back Better" has been around. It's may just be a set of words in many cases, but if we can hold on to that there have been positive changes, and not just in marginalised communities, but for all of us in different ways, as well as the negatives, and try actively to work against the idea that, and I'm sure Raina will agree with me here, that you get the vaccines out there and then we can all go back to behaving as we did 13 months ago or more. It's not going to be like that, and once we face up to that, I think we'll be able to engage much more creatively for all sorts of communities with life in the future.
Absolutely. I love that idea of build back better, and I think that you're completely right. It seems like there's creative solutions as much as technological frameworks or any kind of non-creative solutions that kind of will build this way. I'm excited to see what some of those might be. Jules, I want to ask you as well, have you seen in any of your communities of sex workers that there are any positives around these changes that have happened around COVID, around the move to online or anything like that, or has it predominantly been experiences of kind of loss of income and of hardship and of those kinds of things?
Look, I think it's both, and it's definitely, I think, for us as sex worker organisations, and it's actually broadened our reach, particularly a greater inclusion for, sex workers that were basically, regional sex workers, regional remote sex workers as well, which I think was really fantastic. And like Jackie spoke about, I mean, there were seemingly issues that seemed like for a long time that were intractable, that suddenly all of a sudden became, there was movement. We saw movement on, which was really fantastic. But I do think that definitely it broadened our connection to community, which was fantastic. It's, we hope to kind of maintain that. And in terms of how we communicate, so it's not just those kind of face-to-face meetings, so that we have a much kind of broader constituency and broader connection to a much wider array of sex workers. But however, I mean, in some of those challenges in the kind of virtual environment, particularly for people, it's English, for whom English is a second language. I think in those, it was a bit of having to kind of adapt to, using kind of translation and having those peer translations on those online platforms was a completely different experience that we had to adapt to, and having in-language consultations and in-language meetings, because it was very difficult for many different languages to be running at the same time, and for those conversations to be running at the same time, and for that to be a very interactive experience as we usually do face to face. But yeah, I think that there has definitely been some improvements, but yeah, against a backdrop of hardship, as you say. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I do just want to remind anyone watching that the Q&A is open. Please, if anything that we've been talking about or anything that has come up provokes further questions, I'm very interested in hearing from you. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the kind of recent context of talking about sexual assault in Australia. Just as a heads up for anybody who's watching and just wants to, skip away for a few minutes, and we're going to have a slide up in a second that's got a couple of helplines and information and stuff like that. But it's come up a little bit today, but it's really hard to look at celebrating International Women's Day when we're more aware than ever about the sexual assault and abuse that so many women experience and have experienced throughout history. And that comes from over the past few years of the #MeToo movement, and more recently kind of in the national media, as the media either brings to light or hides what has been happening kind of, in the halls of government. And it can feel like quite an endemic issue beyond our ability to kind of process or approach. And I first want to ask, I open to the panel, whoever's interested in responding, how has it been to see and to hear these stories in the past few weeks? Because it feels, to me, it feels it was shocking but not surprising, I guess, and what that experience has been like for you. If someone wants to, put a hand up or start talking, please go for it. Yeah, Jackie, thank you.
I think for many of us, and most of us have had our own experiences of whatever severity and however long ago of these sorts of things. I think for me it's been a combination of harrowing, dispiriting. There's that sense, however, the combined sense of a lot of energy at the moment about of protest, of shock, of wanting to make things different in the future. And I'm afraid also that sense of, well, we've been here before. And if we're serious about this, we really do need to make it different from now on. I think also one thing that I felt very strongly over the last couple of weeks has been most of the talk has been about believing women and men when they are sexually assaulted too, believing women and listening to women and so on. And sometimes I feel that the issue is actually less about believing women, but that people do believe them, but they just don't care. And we're not important enough. So perhaps the next step is to move beyond. We need to believe those voices, hear those voices and so on, but we need to care enough about the equality of women, the equality of female children and so on, to take it seriously and imagine that actually it can be different. And I take myself to task here, that sense of sort of tiredness and exhaustion about having been here so many times, taking a deep breath and saying, just don't give up, because it could be different. It wouldn't take an enormous amount to make it different. Part of it is about government and others in power just taking it seriously enough.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Jules?
Yeah, look, I think particularly when we're talking about sexual assault for sex workers, this has been a long-standing issue of actually, being taken seriously in the justice system or by the police, or there's this kind of perception, these misconceptions that as a sex worker it's not possible to be sexually assaulted, that somehow it's like by the fact that that somebody has sex worked or has ever sex worked, that means that somehow their character is flawed, and it is, until very recently, it has been even in sentencing guidelines as mitigating factors. And there's that kind of sense of slut shaming around sex workers as well, and that's been brought into sexual assault cases, even let alone when these cases happen at work. So I think that this is a major issue where too many times sex workers have not been taken, their reports haven't been taken on by police, or even if it does get to that point where it does go to court, where a whole range of irrelevant and unrelated factors are brought in to the case. So this is a major issue that sex worker organisations have been advocating on for a really long time, and it continues to be a battle, unfortunately.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Raina, I want to throw the same question to you. What has it been like kind of seeing these disclosures and seeing the way this has been communicated?
It's been really depressing because, as I said, it just reminds you that not much has changed in terms of, but I think there is quite a different culture in Parliament, to be honest, from what we've heard from other parliamentarians as well, from women in Parliament. The standard and the culture there is different to what the expectation is in society in general, and that's really disturbing. That needs to change. The thing that's been brought some hope, I think, is the young people coming forward and starting a movement of talking about sexual assault, the teenagers. And I think that's the future, they're our future. And I don't think we can expect, people who are set in their ways to change the way they think. But maybe, in a generation or so, we can see real change. I don't know. But then you've got those competing forces of, really, which we've seen in democratic countries around the world. We've seen the rise of authoritarianism and sort of a shift towards totalitarianism and, erosion of freedoms, freedom of speech and freedom of expression and silencing of dissent. And so I think we're in a really, pivotal time in terms of politically, for the world, for where we're all headed. We saw, in the US, that a movement that's still very strong in the US, almost overthrew the government. That was the objective. And if that had happened, then democracy would have ended there. So I think, we've got to think about it in that context. There are plenty of people here who aspire to that movement and to be like people in that movement in the US. So, you know, we've heard of certain political groups going off to meet with the gun lobby in the US, trying to make, you know, guns a thing here. And it's just, I think we've got to all just wake up and smell the coffee. You know, there's a lot of really serious issues, and if we ignore it and think it doesn't affect us, it's like the kind of legislation that's eroded our freedoms in Australia. It's just crept in with bipartisan support, things like the metadata laws, the ability of government to spy on you without a warrant in some instances. It's people have just been asleep at the wheel while these quite momentous changes have been occurring. We don't have a family court anymore. What's going on?
Yeah. No, I completely hear you. I think that it's, I don't know, sometimes I wake up a bit in the morning, and even when I do try and smell the coffee, it's all a bit, it can be a bit overwhelming, it can be a bit terrifying. And I think that it's incredibly important that we're keeping as much of those perspectives in mind as possible when we think about kind of what the future looks like. We're close to the finish of this session, and I want to say thank you so much to all of the panelists. And I kind of want to just pivot off of what you were saying, Raina. I think that it's incredibly important to be keeping aware of all the intense and difficult, horrifying things that are happening in the world. But I also, every International Women's Day, I try and reflect on a moment or a kernel of hope about what could happen. You know, you mentioned the fact that it is these younger generations of women that are really powering through and changing the world. And I would just love to hear from all of you before we finish up, what is a hope that you hold on to for the women of the future, for the post-COVID women's world that we are trying to build. Raina, I would love to throw to you first.
Okay. Yeah, look, I think the young people are our future, and that's my hope, that they'll find a different way to the ways that we've tried to navigate, because of the kind of pathways that we've taken to this point in time, you know, looking way back in history as well. I think, you know, we have gone backward in some ways, and I think the hope is with the youngsters, that they will grow up thinking about these things differently. Our young boys as well, you know, I think as parents we've got a responsibility to bring up our children, you know, our youngsters to be that change. Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Jackie, I wanna throw to you. What is the hope that you hold for the future of womanhood, but also just in general?
The hope, I think, is that younger people in the future will be able to work collaboratively with each other, with all sorts of groups across all sorts of boundaries and barriers, not necessarily expecting them all to agree with each other, but all of them having the same kind of the prize that they're aiming for, the sort of future that they're aiming for. But maybe look back on us previous generations with a little bit of mercy, and remember to try not to reinvent the wheel, because there has been past experience that you can move on from rather than repeat.
Absolutely. I think those are really, really valuable things to be keeping in mind. Jules, I'm going to throw to you last. What is your hope?
You know, I think that I feel hopeful about women in all, you know, the respect of the autonomy and including bodily autonomy of women in all our diversity, regardless of our occupation, our race, sex, gender, ableism, you know, ability. So I think that it's great to speak on panels such as this to kind of raise awareness of the diversity of women's and respect of all our rights.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And I would like to jump in now and say a very, very warm and heartfelt thank you to our three amazing panellists here, Raina MacIntyre, Jackie Leach Scully and Jules Kim, and also a very, very special thank you to Liz Duck-Chong, who has done an amazing job of facilitating this session. I think that she has brought such nuance and thoughtfulness to the discussion. So I feel very lucky to have been in the presence of four very inspiring women today. Thank you for your wisdom and your thoughtfulness, and all the very best. Let's hope that what we have talked about here and what Liz has helped you to imagine might come true. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for your attention.